the first time my wife mentioned male privilege. We were having dinner at our favorite restaurant. She had just finished a 3-day social justice workshop and was buzzing with new terminology. I nodded along, genuinely interested in understanding her perspective. Little did I know this conversation was the first drop in what would become a tidal wave threatening to drown our 5-year marriage. Within weeks, these discussions evolved from occasional conversations into structured daily interventions. Every evening after work, I'd walk through the door to find her sitting at the dining table, notebook open, ready to dissect my day's transgressions. At first, I approached these sessions with an open mind. Maybe I did have blind spots that needed addressing. "Today you mansplained to the cashier about how credit card machines work," she'd say, looking up from her notebook where she'd been tracking my behavior. "And you took up too much space on the subway by spreading your legs." I tried explaining that the cashier had asked for help, and the subway was nearly empty, but my explanations were just labeled as defensive responses typical of privileged men when confronted. Soon, these interventions became more creative. She started a whiteboard tallying system in our living room. Categories included interruptions, mansplaining incidents, and domestic labor imbalance. Despite doing half the housework, my column always mysteriously showed fewer contributions. The rules kept changing. When I washed dishes, I was performing domestic labor for praise rather than responsibility. When I didn't mention doing chores, I was hiding my contributions to maintain domestic power dynamics. 3 months in, she created a jar system. Every time I displayed privileged behavior, I had to put money in a jar. These funds were then donated to women's organizations, a concept I actually supported, but the implementation felt increasingly manipulative. "You used the phrase, 'actually.' The fact is, during our conversation with my sister," she said one evening, sliding the jar toward me, "that's a $5 fine for leveraging intellectual authority." The most surreal moment came when she started timing how long I spoke during conversations with friends. She'd discreetly use her phone's stopwatch, then later present me with pie charts showing disproportionate airtime. Even when I stayed quieter in subsequent gatherings, I was accused of weaponizing silence and forcing emotional labor from others to maintain conversation flow. 6 months into this new normal, I barely recognized myself. I second-guessed every word, analyzed every movement. Was stretching my arms a form of space domination? Was my tone accidentally authoritative? The constant scrutiny was crushing my spirit. The breaking point came during a phone call with my father, who was going through chemotherapy. After hanging up, visibly emotional, my wife slid her notebook toward me. "You monopolized that conversation. Your father barely spoke." I stared at her, something cold crystallizing in my chest. My father was weak from treatment. He wanted to hear about my day to distract himself. And here she was, timing our conversation, turning even this sacred moment into another indictment of my existence. That night, lying awake beside her, I realized I was living in a psychological prison constructed of ever-changing rules and moving goalposts. Every natural behavior was pathologized, every intention questioned. This wasn't education or growth. It was control wrapped in the language of progress. And for the first time, a thought floated through my mind that felt both terrifying and freeing. I didn't have to live this way. The interventions reached a new level when my wife started inviting her friends to observe and participate. What had been humiliating in private became excruciating in public. Every Tuesday and Thursday, 2 or 3 women would join us in our living room, sitting in a semicircle as my wife presented her findings on my behavioral patterns. Last week, he used the phrase, "I think you're overreacting," during a discussion about household expenses, she announced to her nodding audience. Classic gaslighting technique. I wanted to point out that she had suggested spending $3,000 on a workshop called Dismantling the Patriarchy through Interpretive Dance when we were saving for a home down payment. But I'd learned that defending myself only extended these sessions. One of her friends, a psychology student, took particular interest in analyzing me. "Your defensiveness is textbook fragile masculinity," she'd say, scribbling notes as if I were a lab specimen. "Notice how he crosses his arms when confronted with his privilege." I uncrossed my arms, then realized that action 2 would be interpreted as a response to her observation. There was no winning move. My wife began documenting everything in a leather-bound journal she called the Privilege Chronicles. She recorded my problematic statements verbatim, analyzing them with colored highlighters: blue for mansplaining, pink for implicit misogyny, yellow for unconscious dominance behaviors. The journal appeared strategically around our home for me to accidentally discover. Opening the refrigerator for breakfast, the journal was propped against the milk. Getting ready for bed, the journal sat on my pillow. Its presence was a constant reminder that I was being watched, evaluated, found wanting. The most absurd session occurred when I was accused of breathing too loudly during a dinner with her parents. Apparently, my respiratory patterns were a subconscious attempt to audibly dominate the sonic landscape of feminine conversation. I tried reasoned dialogue. I understand examining societal structures, but don't you think this has become excessive? We're not communicating anymore. I'm just being lectured at. She smiled condescendingly. This discomfort you're feeling? That's what women experience every day. The fact that you can't handle even this small taste proves how necessary these interventions are. Her circular logic was impenetrable. Any objection I raised simply reinforced her point. If I accepted the criticism without comment, it proved my guilt. If I questioned it, I was demonstrating privilege. If I remained silent, I was using silence as a weapon. Most disturbing was how she began rewriting our history. The early years of our relationship, which I remembered as equal, loving, and supportive, were retroactively reinterpreted through this new lens. Remember when you suggested hiking on our third date? Classic example of asserting outdoor dominance in male-controlled terrain. I did remember. She had mentioned enjoying nature, and I'd suggested a popular trail. Now this simple moment was evidence of my apparent campaign of patriarchal oppression. 8 months in, I became a hollow version of myself. I spoke less at home and withdrew from friends. Work became my sanctuary, the only place where I wasn't analyzed for unconscious bias every time I opened my mouth. The final straw came when I found a document on our shared computer, Intervention Escalation Strategy. It outlined plans for the coming months, including public confrontations, involving my workplace in accountability structures, and what she called privilege aversion therapy. As I stared at the screen, a stark realization dawned on me. This wasn't just controlling behavior anymore. This was calculated psychological breakdown, and no amount of self-improvement or understanding on my part would ever be enough, because the goalposts would always move. The game was rigged, and I'd been playing by rules designed to ensure I could never win. After discovering the intervention escalation strategy, I knew I needed perspective from someone who wasn't entrenched in my wife's ideology. During lunch breaks, I started meeting with a counselor who specialized in relationship dynamics. I was careful not to mention these sessions to my wife. She would have interpreted seeking outside counsel as another form of privilege assertion. The counselor listened to my descriptions of daily life without judgment. During our third session, she placed her notepad down and looked at me directly. What you're describing isn't social justice education. It's emotional abuse with a progressive veneer. Her words hit me like a thunderbolt. I'd been so caught up questioning my own behavior that I hadn't recognized the manipulative patterns for what they were. The constant criticism, public humiliation, rewriting of history, isolation from friends. These were textbook abuse tactics, just packaged in contemporary language. But she genuinely believes she's helping society, I countered. Perhaps, the counselor replied. Many controlling people justify their behavior through larger causes. That doesn't make the impact any less harmful. Armed with this new framework, I began seeing our interactions differently. The privilege jar wasn't accountability, it was financial control. The public interventions weren't education, they were ritualized humiliation. The constant documentation wasn't awareness raising, it was surveillance. I decided to make one final attempt at honest communication. I suggested couples therapy, careful to propose a counselor who specialized in progressive relationship dynamics, so she couldn't dismiss the idea outright. Therapy, she scoffed. That's your response to being confronted with your privilege? To medicalize my legitimate concerns. I'm not medicalizing anything, I replied calmly. I'm suggesting we find a healthier way to communicate that doesn't involve one person constantly criticizing the other. She paced our living room, incredulous. You've completely missed the point. These interventions aren't about your feelings. They're about justice. The fact that you're centering your comfort shows exactly why this work is necessary. But a relationship can't survive when one person appointing themselves as the other's judge, jury, and prosecutor, I said. Her eyes narrowed. So now you're comparing social justice to a trial? This is exactly the kind of false equivalence that privileged people use to avoid accountability. I took a deep breath, maintaining my composure despite the familiar sting of her dismissal. I'm just asking for mutual respect, for conversations instead of lectures, for partnership instead of surveillance. For a moment, something flickered across her face, perhaps recognition of the reasonable nature of my request. But just as quickly, it hardened into righteous certainty. If you're unwilling to acknowledge your privilege and do this important work, then you're part of the problem, she said, voice rising. And I need to decide if I can remain married to someone who refuses to recognize their role in systemic oppression. There it was, the ultimatum I'd sensed coming for months. Submit to the endless interventions and escalations, or the marriage was over. In her framework, those were the only two options. I think we both need to consider what we want from this relationship, I replied, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through me. That night, she slept in the guest room. I lay awake, the weight of realization settling over me. For nearly a year, I'd been trying to prove my worthiness through an evaluation system designed to ensure I would always fail. No matter how I changed my behavior, new offenses would be found. No matter how I phrased my thoughts, problematic patterns would be identified. The truth crystallized with painful clarity. This wasn't about growth or justice or creating a better relationship. This was about power and control, dressed in the language of equality. And for the first time, I allowed myself to fully consider a thought that had been growing in the back of my mind. Perhaps the most self-respecting thing I could do was walk away. The breaking point came during a dinner party with 4 other couples. My wife had been documenting my transgressions throughout the evening on her phone. I noticed her typing after I poured myself a drink without offering one to everyone first, resource hoarding. When I accidentally interrupted someone, conversational dominance. And when I disagreed about a film's interpretation, invalidating feminine perspectives. Midway through dinner, she clinked her glass. I think this is a perfect teachable moment for everyone, she announced. I've been helping my husband understand his privilege through daily interventions, and tonight provides some excellent examples. The table fell silent. I felt heat rising in my neck as 12 eyes turned toward me. In just the past hour, she continued, consulting her phone, he's exhibited 7 distinct privilege behaviors that reinforce patriarchal norms. She proceeded to list every perceived offense, complete with timestamps and contextual analysis. One couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. Another friend studied her plate intently. Only one woman nodded enthusiastically throughout the presentation. So as you can see, my wife concluded, these interventions are crucial for dismantling internalized dominance patterns. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for my usual apologetic response. In the past, I would have awkwardly acknowledged my mistakes to end the public shaming. But something had shifted within me. I placed my napkin beside my plate and spoke calmly. I appreciate your feedback. I'll reflect on that. My measured response clearly disappointed her. The anticipated spectacle of my public contrition didn't materialize. After an awkward silence, conversation tentatively resumed, though the evening never recovered its earlier warmth. On the drive home, my wife fumed. That was completely inadequate. You were supposed to acknowledge each point and explain how you'd correct those behaviors. We were at a dinner party. I replied evenly. It wasn't the appropriate setting for that kind of intervention. Every setting is appropriate for confronting privilege, she snapped. Your discomfort is exactly what needs to be examined. I nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition. This moment clarified everything. There would never be a boundary she respected, never a line she wouldn't cross in service of her righteous cause. My humanity had become secondary to her ideology. The next morning, I called in sick to work and waited until she left for her weekly Dismantling Heteropatriarchy workshop. Then I made 3 important calls. First, to my bank, where I secured my financial accounts and started the process of separating our finances. I wasn't looking to hide assets. Everything would be divided fairly, but I needed to ensure she couldn't empty our accounts in retaliation. Second, to a lawyer who specialized in men's divorce rights. I explained my situation with clinical detachment, as if discussing someone else's life. The lawyer listened without interruption. Unfortunately, this isn't as uncommon as you might think, he said. Let's discuss how to protect you through this process. Third, to a real estate agent. I needed to know my housing options if I needed to leave quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, I operated with strategic precision. I gathered documentation of the escalating interventions, photographs of the whiteboard tallies, screenshots of the intervention escalation strategy, copies of the privilege journal entries she'd left for me to find. I secured my important documents and irreplaceable personal items in a safe deposit box, all while continuing to participate in the daily interventions, offering just enough engagement to avoid suspicion. I'd respond with neutral phrases like, "I hear your concern," and "That's an interesting perspective," neither accepting nor rejecting her criticisms. My wife mistook this change in tactics for submission. "The interventions are finally working." I overheard her telling a friend on the phone. "He's becoming more receptive to the process." In reality, each session strengthened my resolve. I wasn't becoming receptive. I was becoming clear-eyed about what I needed to do. The man who had entered this marriage would have continued trying to prove his worthiness through her impossible metrics. But that man was gone. In his place stood someone who recognized manipulation dressed as righteousness and who understood that self-respect sometimes requires walking away. 2 more weeks passed as I finalized my preparations. Then I received a text that confirmed the moment had arrived. "Special intervention session tonight. Invited the whole accountability group. Be home by 6 sharp." I arrived home at exactly 5:55 p.m., briefcase in hand. Inside wasn't work materials, but everything I needed for what would be the final intervention session. Through the living room window, I could see 7 women arranged in a semicircle. My wife stood before a newly purchased whiteboard with comprehensive privilege assessment written in bold letters at the top. I straightened my tie, took a deep breath, and walked through the door with deliberate confidence. The room fell silent as I entered. Right on time, my wife said, checking her watch. "Tonight is important. After nearly a year of interventions, we're conducting a thorough evaluation of your progress." I nodded politely, setting my briefcase beside the chair positioned conspicuously in the center of the room, the designated hot seat. "We'll begin with a review of recent incidents," she continued, uncapping a red marker. "Then move to testimonials from the accountability group about patterns they've observed. Finally, we'll outline the intensified intervention strategy for the coming year." The casual way she announced her plans to continue this indefinitely confirmed everything. This wasn't a phase or a temporary exploration. This was who she had become and what our marriage had become. "Before we start," I said calmly, "I have something I'd like to share with the group, if that's acceptable." My wife hesitated, thrown by this departure from the usual script. "We have a full agenda. It won't take long," I assured her, opening my briefcase. I removed a folder and stood, not in the designated chair, but alongside it, a small act of defiance against the choreographed humiliation. For the past year, I've been the subject of what my wife calls privilege interventions. I've participated willingly, believing they came from a genuine desire for growth and equity. I opened the folder and removed a stack of printed emails. However, I recently discovered these exchanges between my wife and several members of this group. My wife's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Those are private. They detail how to, quote, break down resistant male subjects through escalating psychological pressure. They outline techniques for creating compliance through controlled environments and social isolation." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. 2 women exchanged uncomfortable glances. Another stared at the floor. "These aren't strategies for education or growth," I continued, voice steady. "They're manipulation tactics. And they have a clinical term, emotional abuse." My wife's face reddened. "You're completely twisting this." I held up my hand, a gesture she had used countless times to silence me. "I'm not finished speaking." The reversal of our usual dynamic hung in the air. I removed a second document from my folder. "This is an assessment from a licensed therapist specializing in emotional abuse, based on documented incidents from our relationship. I've removed all identifying details, but the conclusion is clear. These interventions fit the clinical criteria for systematic psychological manipulation." I placed the paper on the coffee table. One woman leaned forward to glance at it, then quickly sat back. "I've spent a year examining my behavior, questioning my motives. and trying to be a better person. I still believe in equality and examining privilege. But what's happened in this marriage isn't about justice or growth. It's about control. My wife's expression hardened. That's exactly what someone unwilling to confront their privilege would say. I'd anticipated this response, the circular logic that transformed any defense into further evidence of guilt. But her words no longer had power over me. I've reflected deeply on what a healthy relationship requires. I continued. Mutual respect, boundaries, the ability to speak without fear of constant criticism, the presumption of good intent. I removed a final document from my briefcase. This is a petition for divorce on grounds of emotional cruelty. It includes documentation of the systematic psychological abuse I've experienced. My lawyer will contact yours tomorrow. The silence was absolute. Several women shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My wife stared at me, her expression moving from shock to anger to something like fear. You can't just. I'm exercising my privilege to walk away from an abusive relationship, I said, closing my briefcase. The privilege of self-respect. The privilege of choosing not to remain in a marriage where I'm treated as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. I moved toward the door, then paused. I've arranged to stay elsewhere tonight. I'll coordinate a time to collect my belongings. I turned to the group. Ladies, this concludes tonight's intervention. As I walked to my car, I felt no triumph, no vindictive satisfaction, only the quiet certainty that comes from finally acting in alignment with your own self-worth. Behind me, through the still open door, I could hear the murmur of confused voices, my wife's among them, already trying to reframe what had just happened. But I was beyond the reach of her interpretations now. For the first time in a year, I was breathing freely. The aftermath unfolded with predictable drama. Within hours, my phone exploded with messages from her friends, alternating between condemnation and attempts at mediation. My wife launched what she called a restorative justice process, which mainly consisted of trying to damage my reputation among mutual acquaintances. She framed my departure as an inability to handle accountability, as patriarchal fragility in action. I maintained radio silence, communicating only through my attorney. This wasn't out of spite, but self-preservation. Any direct engagement would be twisted and weaponized. The divorce proceedings moved forward with clinical efficiency. The documentation I'd gathered proved invaluable, not for revenge, but for establishing clear boundaries during the separation. 6 months later, sitting in my new apartment across town, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had transformed. The constant weight of scrutiny had lifted. I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed, no longer rehearsed responses to potential accusations, no longer navigated my home like a minefield. The most surprising outcome was how many mutual friends reached out privately. What happened in your marriage has been happening in our friendship group too, one woman confided. The constant correction, the public call-outs, the inability to have normal conversations anymore. It's exhausting. Another friend admitted, I played along because questioning anything meant being labeled problematic. But watching what happened to you made me realize how toxic it's become. Even one member of the accountability group contacted me. I joined because I believed in the cause, she wrote. But that final night, seeing everything laid out so clearly, it wasn't education. It was something else entirely. These conversations reinforced what I'd slowly realized. Genuine progress doesn't come through domination or control, regardless of how righteous the language used to justify it. My ex-wife attempted reconciliation exactly once, 3 months post-divorce. She suggested meeting for coffee to process what happened. I politely declined. Her response was telling. This refusal to engage is exactly the privileged behavior that necessitated the interventions in the first place. Her words confirmed that nothing had changed. Even now, she was incapable of seeing me as an equal partner with valid boundaries. The psychological framework that had poisoned our marriage remained firmly in place. Dating again felt strange at first. I found myself automatically monitoring my behavior, waiting for corrections that never came. During my second date with an environmental scientist, I caught myself apologizing for mentioning statistics about her field. Why are you apologizing? She asked, genuinely confused. I thought I might have come across as explaining your own profession to you, I admitted. She laughed. You were adding to the conversation, not lecturing me. That's how discussions work. Her response was a balm to a wound I hadn't realized was still raw. Healthy communication wasn't a minefield. It was a dance of give and take, of mutual sharing without constant suspicion of ulterior motives. A year after walking away, I can say with certainty, I support equality. I believe in examining privilege and working toward justice. But I understand now that true progress comes through mutual respect, good faith, and recognizing each other's humanity, not through control, humiliation, or psychological manipulation. The most valuable lesson wasn't about gender politics or social justice. It was about recognizing when righteous language is being used to justify unrighteous behavior, about the courage to walk away from situations that diminish your humanity, no matter how noble the stated intentions. Some might see my story as a rejection of accountability or growth. It's the opposite. It's about taking responsibility for my own well-being, about refusing to participate in my own dehumanization, about recognizing that no cause, however worthy, justifies emotional abuse. The privilege my wife never expected me to exercise was the privilege we all deserve, the right to be treated with basic dignity, the right to walk away from those who would deny us that dignity, the right to build a life where growth comes through genuine connection rather than constant correction. That final night, as I drove away from what had been our home, a weight lifted that I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. With each mile, I reclaimed something essential that had been systematically stripped away, not privilege, but personhood. And that, I discovered, was something I would never again allow anyone to take from me.